Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. My name is Craig Johnson, and I'm director of the Guelph Institute of Development Studies here at the University of Guelph. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here today for the 2019 Hopper Lecture in International Development. By my count, this is the 23rd Hopper Lecture that we've had here on campus, and it's the second in our World in 2030 speaker series that's happening this year at the University of Guelph. The Hopper Lecture is named after Dr. David Hopper, who was the first president of IDRC, the International Development Research Center. Dr. Hopper spent his formative years conducting his doctoral fieldwork in India, as well as serving briefly as an associate professor in the Ontario Agricultural College. So it's particularly fitting that Dr. Ramachandra Guha is here today to deliver the annual Hopper Lecture. I note that today also marks the beginning of the global climate strike. What better way to reflect on the excesses and injustices of our world system by learning about the life and the work of Mahatma Gandhi. In a moment, I'll invite our President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Franco Vaccarino, to introduce Dr. Guha. Before doing so, I'd first like to acknowledge that we reside on the ancestral lands of the Arawandran people, and more recently, the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer our respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and this acknowledgement reminds us of our important connection to this land where we learn and work. Finally, I'd like to extend a special thanks to a number of people who were instrumental in making today possible. Debbie Bowie, Rachel Estock, Sharada Srinivasan, and especially Steffi Hamann. I'd also like to thank IDRC, whose endowment has supported the annual Hopper Lecture since 1993. Now I'd like to invite our President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Franco Vaccarino, to give the opening remarks. Dr. Vaccarino.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Johnson and Craig, for those kind remarks and for kicking off this wonderful lecture. It's my pleasure, of course, to welcome all of you to the University of Guelph and to the Hopper Lecture, which I always appreciate people receiving a bit of context for the lecture and understanding our connection with Hopper Lecture, and we were talking about that with Dr. Guha earlier. Today's Hopper Lecture highlights themes that are central. Truly central to the mission of the university. The themes of internationalism, and you hear more and more about that as a priority for us, environmentalism, and of course sustainability in its largest sense, in the largest sense of that word. And all of these things are really at the core of our mission, which is captured in a very simple two words: improve life. And the simplicity, I think, reflects also the profundity of those two words, to improve life. And it's something that I really like that tagline because of its simplicity, and it's just a reminder of why we do what we do. Today's lecture also commemorates the 150th birth anniversary of Gandhi, and it's a celebration. It's also part of our ongoing series called The World in 2030. So in 2015, the United Nations launched 17 Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved by the year 2030. And these goals include tackling tough and complex issues like poverty, hunger, equity, and climate change. And they're driven by a common purpose, a common purpose and denominator, and that is to leave no one behind. You know, any one of these themes on their own are certainly something we strive for, but that reminder to leave no one behind reminds us of the breadth and the depth of the challenges at hand, and to do it in a complete way. And I'm so pleased that this year's Hopper Lecture is hosted by the newly created Guelph Institute of Development Studies. And the Institute's mandate is to promote positive and inclusive change in the world. This aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and really, in my mind, there's a simple kind of concept that captures the mandate, and that is making sure that we keep our humanity our humanity at the center of a very rapidly changing and fast-paced world. I'd also like to thank Dr. Shareda Srinivasan from our Department of Sociology and Anthropology, who's been working to enhance our international relations with India and who's been instrumental in bringing today's speaker to Guelph. Dr. Srinivasan has been a great support, a great colleague, and truly a leader as we have continued to strengthen our ties with India, which is a real priority for us in the months and years ahead. And now, it's my absolute pleasure, and I'm especially delighted to introduce this year's Hopper lecturer, Dr. Ramachandra Guha. Dr. Guha, considered one of the preeminent living historians of Gandhi. And I have to say it was a particular pleasure getting to know Dr. Guha over lunch. And it's amazing when you have a focused event like a lunch, how much you can cover in a very short period of time. And I had the good fortune of hearing some of Dr. Guha's insights. Dr. Guha, of course, is an acclaimed writer and historian based in Bangalore in South India. His books include a pioneering environmental history called The Unquiet Woods, a social history of cricket called A Corner of a Foreign Field, and a history called India After Gandhi. His most recent book project is a 2-volume biography whose titles are Gandhi Before India and Gandhi, the Years that Changed the World. Reflecting the breadth of his interests and achievement among his numerous awards, his many awards, Dr. Guha has received the Fukuoka Prize for contributions to Asian studies and the Daily Telegraph Cricket Society Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ramachandra Guha.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Craig. Thank you all for being here. This is, as the Vice Chancellor reminded us, the 150th birth anniversary year of Mohandas Gandhi. The actual date is on the 2nd of October. And for the last few weeks, I've been on a road show speaking about him. But I promise you, I'm going to give you a new and special talk, which I've never given anywhere ever before. In keeping with the Hopper lecture, David Hopper is someone who worked in my country, who founded and who helped head an institution, the International Development Research Council, that has nurtured, sustained high-quality research on development, including in my country. And I thought, in consultation with Sharda and Craig, that I should speak on Gandhi, but on a theme related to the legacy of Hopper, the work of Guelph in sustainable development. And so I'm going to speak on a rather little-known aspect of Gandhi's life and legacy, his work as what I would call a proto-environmentalist. He did not use the word environmentalist. It wasn't common in his day. But some of the things he said and did and reflected upon have a direct bearing to the climate change and environmental crisis today. And as a historian, as a student of Gandhi's thought, I have been able to excavate, I think, enough evidence to suggest that, not that Gandhi has the solutions to all our environmental problems today, not that he anticipated all our environmental problems today, but still it would be useful for us and salutary for us to listen to some of the things he said, scattered through his many writings on politics, society, culture, non-violence, are actually some very acute reflections which I'm going to offer you on the environmental predicament. Gandhi, I'm going to begin with a description of Gandhi's visit to Oxford in the year 1931. He had gone to England after a very long time, and he was called to Oxford to speak. And there was an Indian student who was in the audience. He is someone who's absolutely forgotten now, but in his time, he was a very well-known Indian journalist. His name was D.F. Karaka, and he was also, incidentally, the first Indian president of the Oxford Union. And as an Oxford student, here he was at Balliol College, while the greatest living Indian had come to speak. And he wrote about this visit of Gandhi to Oxford that the students who flocked to hear Gandhiji speak came there to see with the naked eye and in the flesh the man who with Christ, Lenin, Shakespeare will go down through the ages and one who belongs not to an age but to all time. Now note the juxtaposition of the names. Why Christ? Because England is largely a Christian country. Why Shakespeare? Because Shakespeare was the greatest writer ever produced by England. Why Lenin? Because it's just a decade after the Russian Revolution, and many, certainly Oxford students, are enchanted by the ideas of Bolshevism. But all three Westerners, and here he's telling them that, look, here is this man from my country, dressed in a loincloth, not in a three-piece suit, speaking softly, but in time to come, he will rank with Christ, Lenin, and Shakespeare. Now, 90 years later, I think we can leave Lenin out of the equation. And maybe add the Buddha. But here is a man who will rank with Christ, the Buddha, and Shakespeare, and Darwin perhaps, and Einstein. You can add a few names, but Lenin certainly goes out of the window. Okay. But here is a precocious anticipation by a young Indian student of the future moral greatness of his countrymen. Now, when Caracas said this, I think he had three aspects of Gandhi's legacy in mind. And it's those three elements of Gandhi's legacy that are best known today. One, of course, is his invention of a technique of protest against unjust authority known as satyagraha, or non-violent civil disobedience. And that technique of protest, first forged by Gandhi in South Africa and then elaborated in India, has of course been used very widely in North America in the civil rights movement, in Eastern Europe by groups like Solidarity, in Myanmar, in Tibet, and in countless other places. The second aspect of Gandhi's relevance to the world was his principled opposition to discrimination based on caste and gender. So he was a freedom fighter who fought for freedom without using violence. At the same time, he was a social reformer who shone a sharp spotlight on the deep divisions within Indian society and sought to remove or at least mitigate them. And the third aspect of Gandhi's legacy, which perhaps is all these three are of great relevance, and the third, in India today, the most relevance, his promotion of interfaith harmony. His belief that religious communities, although they worship different gods, had different cultural orientations, could actually live peaceably together. That's something he particularly tried in India with Hindus and Muslims. It was for the cause of Hindu-Muslim harmony that he lived and gave his life. But Gandhi's ideals of interfaith harmony and religious pluralism are entirely relevant to North America, to Israel and Palestine, to Syria, to Tibet, and many other places. So I think when Dosu Karaka said in 1931 prophetically that Gandhi will come to live with Christ, Shakespeare, and so on, what he had in mind and what we have in mind as if he were to endorse his judgment that Gandhi still lives, what we would have in mind is his legacy in these three areas. As someone who believed that injustice must be opposed but always non-violently. As someone who believed that no society was perfect, India, America, Great Britain, Canada were riven by deep inequalities and hierarchies and forms of discrimination based on caste, gender, race, sexuality, and those needed to be overcome. And the third legacy, of course, was his promotion of interfaith harmony. But I'm going to suggest to you that there's a fourth element in Gandhi's legacy, and that was his environmental thought. Was Gandhi an environmentalist? Could we consider that as the fourth major plank of Gandhi's legacy to us today? Now, if you ask Indian environmentalists today, they'll say, of course, yes. The two most celebrated Indian environmental movements have been the Chipko movement, the peasant protest movement against deforestation in the Himalaya, and the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the movement against a large dam that is still, as we speak, displacing peasant and tribal people in central India. And these two, I mean, they are kind of iconic to the Indian environmental movement. I don't know, regrettably, I don't know that much about Canadian environmentalism. But Chipko and Narmada are to Indian environmentalism what maybe Silent Spring and 3 Mile Island are to US environmentalism. And both these movements were led by Gandhians. The Chipko movement was led by two male Gandhians, Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Sundarlal Bahuguna. The Narmada movement was led by a female Gandhian, Meda Patkar. They would say that what they are doing in opposing destructive development practices, in promoting decentralized forms of sustainable living, are directly inspired by Gandhi. They themselves live a kind of Gandhian lifestyle. They wear homespun. They live lives utter simplicity, transparency. Like Gandhi, they are totally non-violent. Like Gandhi, they have enormous physical courage. They have gone on long fasts. They face police beatings. As an acknowledgement of their debt to Gandhi, they often begin their programs on 2nd October, which is Gandhi's birthday, or 30th January, which is Gandhi's martyrdom day. So, if you ask Indian environmentalists today, was Gandhi an environmentalist? They'll say, of course, yes. That's why we are environmentalists too. But they are activists. They aren't scholars like myself. So I'm going to ask the question, was Gandhi really an environmentalist? Did he in his writings anticipate the contours of the environmental debate as we know it? Some scholars who claim that Gandhi was an early environmentalist cite his anti-industrial polemic of 1906, Hind Swaraj. 1909, Hind Swaraj. Gandhi wrote a book called Hind Swaraj, which is a critique of Western civilization. It's also a defense of non-violence. And if you ask, Gandhians, they'll say, yes, Hind Swaraj provides an alternative development perspective. But actually, it doesn't at all. If you read Hind Swaraj, you'll find that despite its eloquent denunciation of industrial culture, the book has nothing to say about human relations with nature at all. In my own excavation of Gandhi's writings incidentally are incredibly extensive. They cover 97 volumes of his collected works. In my own excavation of his writings, the first intimations of what I am calling a proto-environmentalist sensibility occurs in an article of April 1913, where he makes a telling contrast between the city dweller and the farmer. And the contrast is in terms of their connections to nature and the natural world. I'm going to read out a long quote, one of many long quotes I'm going to read out to you, because these are quotations from Gandhi that are little known, and that it's important that I give them to you in their fullness to buttress my case that he was indeed a proto-environmentalist. So here's the first of several long quotes from a newspaper article of April 1913 that is in one of the anthologies of Gandhi's writings. I quote, "A farmer cannot work without applying his mind. He must be able to test the nature of the soil, watch changes of weather, know how to manipulate his plow skillfully, and be familiar with the movement of the stars, the sun, and the moon. However clever a city dweller may be, every time he goes to a farmer's house, he feels altogether out of his element. The farmer can say how much seed should be sown. By looking at the stars, he can judge the direction even at night. He can make certain deductions from the voice and speed of birds. For instance, when certain birds cluster or sing together, he sees in that a sign of the approach of the monsoon. Thus, the farmer knows enough of astronomy, geography, and geology to serve his needs." I think this is important to say it in Guelph University, but it would be even more important to say it in an Indian university where where the students are upper caste, city dwellers, and think farmers are complete idiots. All right. So here is Gandhi in 1913. Having said all this, he's demonstrated the farmer knows enough of astronomy, geography, and geology to serve his needs. He has to feed his children and has therefore some ideas of the duty of man. And residing as he does in the vast open spaces of this earth, he naturally becomes aware of the greatness of God. Physically, it goes without saying that the farmer is always sturdy. He is his own physician when ill. Thus, we can see that the farmer does have an educated mind. Now, this is an extraordinary quotation from 1913. Because it is Gandhi, he brings in a spiritual angle to claim towards the end that the farmer is closer to God than the urban man. But disregard that. Otherwise, the burden of this passage is resolutely pragmatic. It is to demonstrate to the Indian urban reader that the farmer, far from being an illiterate fool, as the middle-class Indian might think him to be, has an intimate knowledge of the land, of the seasons, of the birds and the animals that makes him more educated than the townsman. The farmer is more educated than the townsman in that he uses the gendered language of the time, he or she is more connected to nature and the natural world, and hence more fitted to take care of the responsibilities of living in nature and the natural world. So this is 1913. The next year, Gandhi leaves South Africa after spending 20 years in the diaspora and goes back to India and tries to make a name as a political activist in India. Now, Gandhi had been away from his homeland for more than 20 years. His mentor, a great social reformer, sadly forgotten in India today, called Gopal Krishna Gokhale, told him, when you go back, spend a year traveling around India. So that's what he did. So he traveled around India, acquainting himself, really for the first time, with the ecological, cultural, social, economic diversity of India. And he continued to travel throughout India all his life. 1914, 15, 16, 1917, he organized a protest movement in Champaran in Bihar. In 1918, he organized a protest movement in rural Gujarat. And through these travels and encounters, he came face to face with colonialism as a system of economic exploitation. In South Africa, where Gandhi lived in the cities and where he represented the small Indian diaspora community, he knew of colonialism as a system of racial exclusion. Indians can't go there, they can't own property there, they can't go to college, they can't cross provincial boundaries. But in India, through his travels to the countryside, he came to understand that colonialism was also a system of economic exploitation. And from this understanding, he arrived at the conclusion, and this is the central, in a sense, the central analytical grid of my lecture today. He came to the conclusion that it would be impossible for India to emulate Western models and Western patterns of industrial development. Gandhi's reservations about the moral industrialization, Gandhi's reservations about the industrialization of India are usually ascribed to moral grounds. The idea that he thought city people are selfish, that consumers are greedy and competitive. But they also had markedly ecological undertones. Take this remarkable passage from his journal, Young India, of December 1928. Just listen to this very carefully. This is what Gandhi writing in 1928. I quote, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West. God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization of the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island kingdom is today keeping the world in chains. If an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts." Now, in my view, I may be biased here, but in my view, the operative phrase is after the manner of the West. He didn't say, God forbid that India take to industrialization, full stop. That's not what he said. Gandhi knew, as well as the next Indian, that this was a desperately poor country where illiteracy, poverty, degradation, starvation deeply disfigured the country, and after the British left, they had to be removed. But somewhere he was saying to find ways of lifting the people out of poverty, of providing a dignified lifestyle to everyone, providing them access to decent education, health, a clean environment, safe housing. We had to find ways that were different from the West because, unlike the West at a comparable stage of industrialization, we did not have, India would not have enjoyed access to the vast colonial resources of the West, which is why he says, the economic imperialism of England is keeping the world in chains. If an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. Also in the 1920s, Gandhi said, to make India like England and America is to find some other races and places of the earth for exploitation. As the West, he said, has already divided the known races outside Europe for exploitation, and there are no new worlds to discover, what can be the fate of India trying to ape the West? What can be the fate of India trying to ape the West economically, not culturally or aesthetically? The answer to Gandhi's question, what can be the fate of India trying to ape the West, is now painfully obvious. For in the last few decades, we have attempted precisely to make India like England and America. However, without the access to resources and markets enjoyed by European and American nations when they began to industrialize, India has to rely on the exploitation of its own people and its environment. The natural resources of the countryside have been increasingly channelized to meet the needs of the urban industrial sector. Now, I live in Bangalore, and I recently wrote a column which this sub-editor gave a rather sensationalist title, How Many Rivers Will Bangalore Drink? It was an account of my hometown as it's expanded, where it's got its water from. When my father was growing up in Bangalore in the 1930s and 40s, Bangalore had 70 large lakes and tanks, from which it drew a fair amount of its water supply. The rest came from wells. Then, as it started expanding, 20 miles from Bangalore, a reservoir was built to tap the waters of two small rivers. In the 1970s, we began foraging further because the city started growing faster and faster. And it also started industrializing, and there was a lot of money, water needed for industrial as well as domestic needs. And in the 1980s, a project was started to pump water up the Kaveri, which is 70 miles away and up a plateau of 2,000 feet. And now there's scarcity because we've gone from 2 million to 8 million in 30 years. So now there's a plan to get water for Bangalore from the Sharavati, which is the northwestern corner of the state, in the Western Ghats, 200 miles away. So Gandhi anticipated this, that the natural resources of the countryside have been channelized to meet the needs of the urban industrial sector. And this has accelerated environmental degradation while depriving rural and tribal communities of their traditional access to forest, water, pasture, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the modern sector has moved aggressively into the remaining resource frontiers of India, the Northeast and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Perhaps Gandhi would not have been surprised, as he recognized a bias towards urban industrial development could result only in a one-sided exploitation of the hinterland. In 1946, he expressed this with characteristic lucidity. The blood of the villages is the cement with which the edifice of the cities is built. So, here is Gandhi's understanding of industrial development. India needs to, quote-unquote, develop. India needs to emancipate its population from poverty, drudgery, illiteracy, ill health, bad sanitation, but has to find ways of doing that do not adopt the same resource-intensive, capital-intensive, energy-intensive methods adopted the West. Now, he is not laying out a systematic alternative development plan for a number of reasons. One, he's not a systematic thinker. Secondly, he's doing many other things. He's trying to free India from the British to non-violence. He's trying to get Hindus and Muslims to live peaceably. He's trying to rid India of the scourge of untouchability. He's trying to bring women into public life. He's cultivating a cadre of collaborators and colleagues and co-workers. So it's a mistake to think, some people who think Gandhi has an environmental charter to offer us, I think that's a mistake. They're very interesting, hidden clues, perceptive, pointed, and often deeply insightful to understand why India made a mistake in mindlessly after 1947 imitating a Western model of industrial development. Now, Gandhi himself was someone who believed that Indian development should be based on village renewal. But at the same time, he understood that the Indian village was not a beautiful, idyllic place. The Indian village was ridden by caste hierarchies. Indian villagers had forgotten how to maintain their common property resources. And in 1937, Gandhi for a long time idealized the Indian village. And I think idealized is the right phrase. And in 1937, a reader wrote to him saying, what is an ideal village, You always talk about an ideal village. What is an ideal village? And one of the remarkable things about Gandhi, incidentally, was that like other powerful men in politics and elsewhere, he listened. And he sometimes answered a criticism. So he got this letter. So you talk about the ideal village, you romanticize the village. What is your ideal village? The letter came from a villager in Birbhum in Bengal. And Gandhi replied. I'm going to quote to you Gandhi's vision of an ideal village, because it's very, very interesting. It's from January 1937. This is my ideal village. It will have cottages with sufficient light and ventilation, built of a material obtainable within a radius of 5 miles of it. The cottages will have courtyards enabling householders to plant vegetables for domestic use and to house their cattle. The village lanes and streets will be free of all avoidable dust. This village will have common wells, not private wells owned by the rich farmers. Common wells accessible to all. It will have houses of worship to which all castes can go, a common meeting place, a village common for grazing his cattle, a cooperative dairy, primary and secondary schools in which vocational education will be the central fact, and it will also have panchayats or village councils for settling disputes. This is my model of an ideal village. So there are many elements of this picture that fit nicely into the utopia of the contemporary environmentalist. Local self-reliance, a clean and hygienic environment, and the collective management and use of those gifts of nature so crucial for survival, water and pasture. But Gandhi also had a very strong practical bent. In the 1930s, he got very interested in the problem of soil fertility and the depletion of soils that were undermining the productivity of Indian agriculture. And he, in 1946, towards the end of his life, he's already in his late 70s at this stage, and he's still thinking about these things, alongside everything else he's thinking about. He writes an article in his magazine where he warns against the excessive mechanization of agriculture, because as he puts it, trading in soil fertility for the sake of quick returns will prove to be a disastrous, short-sighted policy. It would result in virtual depletion of the soil. Gandhi, incidentally, was an enthusiastic supporter of organic manure, which, as he wrote, enriches the soil, improves village hygiene, and saves foreign exchange, and enhances crop yields at the same time. It's mistakenly believed that Gandhi was anti-science, but in his interest in soil fertility, he worked closely with the great pioneering organic scientist Albert Howard. And he reached out to him, studied his writings, wrote about him in his method, in his journals. Now, what I've tried to do so far is present you scattered pieces of evidence. The thing about Gandhi is that there is no Ur text. There is no Communist Manifesto, State and Revolution, Leviathan, Discovery of India, even for Nehru you have Discovery of India. For Ambedkar you may have Annihilation of Caste. There is no Ur text. If you want to understand Gandhi's political, moral, social, environmental thought, you have to go through those 90 volumes and pick out things. Now, maybe you can accuse me of cherry picking. But I think what I've picked, the cherries I've picked, and quoted for you today, give you a clear sense that Gandhi had an intuitive understanding of the ecological limits to unbridled industrialization. God forbid that India take to industrialize in the manner of the West. It will strip the world bare like locusts, and maybe China and India are stripping the world bare like locusts. He had an intuitive understanding of the global limits to unbridled industrialization. He had an interest in rural renewal, in sustainable agriculture, in alternative technology, and of course, what I've not talked about so far, his own lifestyle, which was, bearing where he virtually did nothing at all. In fact, if you go to the Gandhian archive, as I have, his replies were written on the back of somebody's letter, like that. Right. So, at the level of a macro analysis of economic development, his prescriptions for rural reconstruction, his interest in alternative sustainable technologies, his ethics for living, and in all these ways, Gandhi was an early environmentalist. Okay, now I'm going to complicate the picture. One of the problems with the Gandhians generally is that they look absolutely uncritically at Gandhi. So they will tell you Gandhi's writings provide all the answers to our environmental crisis today. This is a problem many great visionary, charismatic thinkers have. Karl Marx famously said, "I am not a Marxist." I am sure that if the great Indian emancipator B.R. Ambedkar was alive today, he would say, "I am not an Ambedkarite." And I think Gandhi would also have said, "I am not a Gandhian." Because the Gandhians of today often fetishize Gandhi. They fetishize Gandhi in, sometimes in their lifestyle. They don't like people who don't wear homespun. They don't like people who enjoy love, an occasional glass of whiskey, whatever else, right? But also they fetishize Gandhi in that they think Gandhi provides all the answers. Though unlike Karl Marx, or unlike Ambedkar, or unlike Christ and the Buddha and Muhammad, there's no text, right? I think, likewise, I'm someone who studied Gandhi all my life. I'm also someone who has admired Gandhi all his life. I mean, if I did not have an admiration for Gandhi, I wouldn't spend 20 years writing his biography. But my admiration is qualified. It's nuanced. It's qualified by understanding that he made mistakes while he lived, and more so by the fact that his ideas don't provide an absolutely credible, internally consistent charter for what India or the world should do today. So what I'm going to do towards the last part I might talk is to complicate the picture. I'm going to ask, so I think I've hopefully demonstrated to you that Gandhi provides a body of ideas and a vocabulary of protest against unjust laws that can be useful to the environmental movement. Both as a thinker and as an activist, he can be of great use to the environmental movement. But I'm now going to ask, are there ways in which the heritage of Gandhi may actually limit the environmental movement? Does Gandhi provide all the answers to those working for environmental renewal today? Some environmentalists are emphatic that he does. Absolutely. So a friend of mine in Pune wrote to me some years ago, he said, "For each and every environmental crisis or event or challenge, one can find inspiration and guidance in Gandhi." Now this kind of certitude is that of the devotee. I mean, you find it in people of faith, but you also find it in people of political faith as well. I'm sure that there are people in India today who will tell you that for each and every social or political or cultural or environmental crisis, Narendra Modi has an answer. So here is a Gandhian saying the same thing. For each and every environmental event or crisis or challenge, one can find inspiration and guidance in Gandhi. Now, this is a serious Gandhian activist telling me this. Now, this emphatic statement, I think, must be qualified. Indeed, I believe that when it comes to the environmental debate, Gandhi does not provide all the answers. Sometimes even he does not even ask the right questions. And I'm going to, in the last part of my talk, alert you to two crucial limitations of Gandhi as an environmental thinker. There may be limitations of Gandhi as a moral philosopher, as a political activist, as a social reformer. That's a separate debate. But although Gandhi was a precocious environmentalist, although he had a clear, sharp, perceptive understanding of the global limits to unregulated economic growth, although he had a practical interest in sustainable alternatives at the level of the village, the farm, the craft, he, as an environmental thinker, he limits environmentalists today in two crucial ways. First, it is striking how heavily focused on the countryside are the horizons of Gandhi and Gandhian environmentalists. So Gandhi said, India lives in her villages. That was wrong even at the time, and it's spectacularly wrong today. India lives more and more in her cities too. And Indian environmentalists working in the Gandhian tradition have yet to come to terms with the fact that India will soon have the largest urban population in the world. The consequences of rapid and unregulated urbanization in India are with us. Massive pollution, overcrowding, water shortages, inadequate housing and sanitation, an inefficient system of transportation, waste of energy, and so on and so forth. But Indian environmentalists haven't engaged with this because they've taken their clue from Gandhi. India lives in the villages. You have the Chipko movement over forests. You have the Narmada movement over water. You have the Gandhamardhan and Niyamgiri movement over tribals and mines, but you have really no urban environmental movement in India of a proper sustainable way. Slowly it is coming. Now, for example, in Chennai, there is now a movement for the renewal and revival of water bodies. But environmental activism in India has been massively biased towards the countryside, and this is also very much an aspect of Gandhi's legacy. Environmental scholarship in India also has been heavily biased towards the countryside. If you look at the work that's been done by historians, sociologists, political theorists, legal specialists on the environment, it's forest law, water law, mining law. Energy, transport, housing, these are things that urban environmental issues are not something that dominate the literature. So that's one area in which Gandhi's thought limits environmentalism, that he had no interest in the city at all. And India is more and more of an urban economy and urban civilization with its own massive range of environmental problems to go with it. Like the city, the wilderness had no attraction for Gandhi. It is true that his practice of vegetarianism and non-violence oriented Gandhi towards a respect for all life. Yet by all accounts, he was hardly moved by the glories of unspoilt nature. You know, he was, in many ways, he had an underdeveloped aesthetic side. You would find Tagore and Nehru writing about the setting sun, but not Gandhi. Right? This may be attributed to his severely practical temperament, for there was nothing of the romantic in Gandhi. There is a contrast here, as I have already suggested, with Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, who was deeply appreciative of the natural beauty of India. There is a near mystical quality to Nehru's invocation in his last will and testament of his affinity with the soil, the mountains, and the rivers of India. There's an anecdote to illustrate this contrast between Gandhi and Nehru, which I'd like to tell you. It's unpublished. It lies in a document that was given to me by the great British historian E.P. Thompson before he died. E.P. Thompson's father, Edward Thompson, worked in India. He was a British missionary sympathetic to Indian aspirations and knew Gandhi and Nehru well. And it is years in India, in the 20s and 30s, Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson's father, Edward Thompson Sr., came to really love the landscape, the countryside, the wildlife, the mountains of India. In 1937, Congress ministries were formed for the first time in different provinces. When they were formed, Edward Thompson was sent by the Rhodes Trust to India on a mission, and while traveling around India with the Congress already in power in several provinces, self-rule had begun, Edward Thompson tried hard to interest the Congress leaders in the cause of saving India's disappearing wildlife. He told them, animal after animal is either extinct or on the danger list. Say, the 1930s, by the way, animal after animal was extinct on the danger list, largely because of the depredatory instincts of British rulers and Indian Maharajas. The population of the tiger had gone from 40,000 in 1850 to 2,000 in 1940 because of this kind of savage depredation. So Thompson was really upset about this. And he confronted Gandhi. He went to Sevagram, Gandhi's ashram in central India, with the problem, because Gandhi was the de facto dictator of the Congress. All the chief ministers of the Congress provinces in Madras and Bombay and so on listen to Gandhi. So Edward Thompson goes to Gandhi and tells him, look, all these animals are disappearing and you must do something about it. Your government is now in power. The Mahatma merely joked, saying, we shall always have the British lion. But then, noting the disappointment on Thompson's face, Gandhi asked him to speak to Jawaharlal Nehru, who might have more interest. And indeed, Nehru did. When Thompson told Nehru about the disappearance of these animals, great Indian animals, the tiger, the rhinoceros, the cheetah, the lion, and so on and so on, the elephant, Nehru wrote a letter to the chief ministers of Congress-ruled states, and a year later, Nehru was able to write to Edward Thompson with some pride that C. Rajagopalachari's last act as Chief Minister of Madras was to create the Periyar Nature Reserve. So nature lovers and those with a focus on the urban environmental world will find no help from Mahatma Gandhi. But between the wilderness and the city lies a vast terrain home to the 700,000 villages of India which Gandhi spoke of so often and so eloquently. It is here, in this terrain between the city and the wilderness, that Gandhi's life and message admit of more direct application, as in the resistance to environmentally destructive projects or in the restoration of a sustainable relationship between the agrarian economy and the natural environment. And all of us, without exception, whether living in the city, the countryside, or the wild, can try and simplify our lifestyles to the extent compatible with individual circumstances, taking our lead from a man who in his own life made remarkably few demands on the earth. And so it is that the environmental movement must perennially return to Mahatma Gandhi and yet seek to go beyond him. Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have some time. We have a fair bit of time.
Yeah, so would someone come up here? Anyone wants to ask a question here? So I just wanted to say, I've given a kind of detailed scholarly historical excavation of Gandhi's ideas and views, but if there are questions on other aspects of the environmental predicament in India today, I'd be happy to answer them as well. Or on other aspects of Gandhi's legacy, I'd be happy to answer them as well. Yeah. I can take you one by one. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for a great start on the Gandhi series as well, and a great perspective. I'm Pavnish Madan from veterinary school here, and it was interesting to hear the interpretation of how the animal welfare kind of aspect was looked into, although you said it was more given into Nehru's terrain to take care of the animal issues. However, one thing which was very famous with Gandhi, and the credit goes to him, was the goat domestication project and how goat became his dear animal. He was one of those people who highlighted the aspect of goat milk in rural population, adaptation of goat as for the rural economy. So I was wondering if you could shed some more light, being a historian in that area, of how that came about and how that changed the economy in the local villages.
No, thank you. That's a very good question. I am not sure I have a complete answer, but I'll try. So first I'll have to tell you about how Gandhi started having goat milk. So Gandhi decided to give up drinking milk. You know, he was an obsessive food fadist. So he decided to give up many things and he gave up milk. Then he almost died. Incidentally, this is something again connected to broadly to Gandhian environmentalism. It's mistaken that Gandhi was anti-science. I'm glad you're a scientist speaking. Gandhi was saved. It's also mistaken that Gandhi was anti-modern medicine. In 1924, his life was saved by a surgeon because of appendicitis. In 1919, his life was saved by a surgeon when he had piles. After that, he was almost dying. And the doctor said, you have to have milk. He said, but I've taken a vow that I will never again have milk. And I don't go back on vows. So his wife, Kasturba, said, your vow was about cow's milk. So that's how he took to goat milk. Okay, now this is a very interesting anecdote. So, and of course the goat went, and the famous stories of, Gandhi walking in London in 1931, and a cockney saying, hey Gandhi, where's your goat? Right, all right. Now, so that's how Gandhi got interested in goat milk. Now, I am not sure there's a direct connection between Gandhi's, dependence on goats and his cultivation of goats in his ashram and the promotion of the goat economy post-independence. That connection I don't think is tenable. But it is important and interesting because, you see, one of the problems, the diversity of Indian agriculture is such, I mean, there are other people in this room who know this much better than me, that unlike in England, you don't have goats. You have sheep to kill and that's it. But it's a cattle economy. In drier parts of India, in the Deccan and in around the Thar Desert, the goat is very important. And it must have been some Indian agricultural scientists who promoted it, recognizing this diversity. But I doubt there's a direct connection between the accidental nature of Gandhi taking to goat milk and that. Maybe. So the goat became not just a cow. Maybe. Yeah.
Thank you for a fabulous lecture. Today marks the start of the global climate strikes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how India is viewing climate change.
Yeah. So, do you want a short answer, a medium answer, a long answer?
As much as you're willing to give,
Okay,
and
thank
our
you.
audience will
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So, first of all, I'm going to say something absolutely heretical. In my view, one of the greatest climate criminals in the modern world is Al Gore. Okay, so if you look at the climate change issue today, in 1992, Al Gore wrote a book called Earth in the Balance. No modern politician knew the dimensions of the environmental crisis as thoroughly as Al Gore did. In the year he wrote Earth in the Balance, he and Bill Clinton came to occupy the White House. In 1997, proceeding in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was being signed. If America had signed, the Europeans were leaders. It's no accident that this young lady is from Europe, from Sweden. Europeans were absolutely leaders. In 1995, I was in Berlin when Helmut Kohl organized a huge, massive climate change, global warming conference and committed all the European countries to cut some targets. If America under Al Gore and Bill Clinton, who knew the science, knew the possibilities, had signed in 1997, China and India would have been compelled to sign. They didn't. Then in 2000, Al Gore ran for election and didn't mention environment once in his campaign. After he lost, he became an environmental campaigner. So this is shocking hypocrisy. I want to put this on record because these are things, politicians have a great way of whitewashing their past. So I think the real missed opportunity was 1997 because if America had signed, I can tell you, China and India would have been compelled to sign and then we would not have had the crisis we're facing today. So that's the first thing. Now, having done that, now of course Trump is going back again. So long as you have America, the most powerful, the richest, the most polluting country in the world, not taking any responsibility, China and India will do virtually nothing. Except mitigation because of, sea level rise and what they have to do with their coastal cities and so on. Right. They are not going to go, I heard just yesterday in McMaster that coal, so-called clean coal, I don't know whether there's something called clean coal, but clean coal is going from Canada to India. Right. So we're not going to stop importing this. You're not going to stop exporting it. So I think this is a huge issue where the original sinner was the America and possibly Gore and, not the Democrats, Gore and Clinton. And we're still paying for it. The second thing I'd like to say is that from the perspective of an Indian, I think India is an environmental basket case, regardless of the climate change crisis. And the climate change crisis and America, the United States, a lack of spectacular irresponsibility gives successive governments of India the excuse not to tackle their domestic environmental problems. We are an environment, even if climate change was not taking place, the extraordinary high levels of air pollution, the depletion of groundwater aquifers, the biological death of our major rivers, the chemical contamination of the soil are all seriously threatening our life, our economy, our society, and our future as a civilization in India today. So we need in India to be, that's why Gandhi's ideas and the idea of the people like Gandhi is so much more relevant, regardless of climate change.
Right. Your lecture was amazing. I just wanted to ask something in regards to one aspect of environmentalism that I feel is often overlooked just because of human reliance on animal products in regards to consumption, clothing, tools, whatever it may be. So we all know, based off evidence available as to right now, that animal agriculture is one of the largest contributors towards the climate crisis. How do you think Gandhian principles would influence, critique, support, or interact or address animal agriculture like in 2019?
So I suppose vegetarianism would be a way forward. And Gandhi was not a kind of a ideological vegetarian. He was a cultural vegetarian, but certainly, reducing demand for meat. But again, I am really not really someone who's very good at prescription and policy. Gandhi's, again, as I said, Gandhi can provide clues, intuitions, ideas. He can't provide a charter or a manifesto. That, so many years after his death, we have to maybe find our own ways around it.
Ram, I think I promised to moderate the talk, but instead I'm going to ask you a question.
Sure.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation today. I wanted to ask you a question about the impact of Gandhi and what you're calling Gandhian thinking and Gandhian movements on the environmental movement. And you mentioned earlier in passing that Gandhi was often classified or characterized as being anti-science.
Yeah.
And I found in my own work that at times a fetishization of science can actually undermine environmental movements. And Gandhi was nothing if not a great storyteller, and he had an image that could mobilize people. So I'm wondering what the relationship between Gandhi and the science of the day or scientists of the day look like, and how that influenced his thinking.
Well, thank you. It's a great question. So there's a famous quote of Gandhi, which I don't have here, where it's in a talk he gave to a science college in Kerala in 1925, where he says something to the effect of, "It is a common superstition that I'm against science." So very interesting. Gandhi was wonderful with words. It's a common superstition that I'm against science. That's not true. I'm against science for its own sake. All I ask of scientists is what I'd ask of my followers, that they orient their science towards alleviating the poverty of Indians. Okay, then it's interesting that he calls his autobiography the story of my experiments with truth. So Gandhi was, you could say, a scientist who wanted scientists to be grounded. I mean, maybe he would have also appreciated the beauty of mathematics and theoretical physics. But in a country as poor as India, he expected scientists to orient their work towards enhancing making the lives of Indians less degraded and less full of drudgery. Now, he didn't say that much about science, but I want to say a little bit, following your question, on Gandhian scientists today. Now, of Gandhian scientists after Gandhi, especially in the context of the environmental debate, there are two quite remarkable Indian scientists whom Indians don't know enough about. And I'd like to say a little bit about them because they were both deeply inspired by Gandhi and they were also personal mentors of mine. One was, and it's very interesting to see their trajectories. One was a man called A.K.N. Reddy. He did his PhD in Imperial College London. He was a world authority on electrochemistry. Until recently, his textbook on electrochemistry was taught all over the world. And then he discovered Gandhi, left the lab, went to the countryside, and started studying the rural economy and started working on making it environmentally sustainable. So he pioneered low-cost housing, biogas plants, and also wrote some very important essays. He had a fact on energy, again, the climate change, the question of climate change. Reddy wrote a magnificent book with 3 scientists, in 1988, well before all this. There were 4 of them. There was someone from Princeton, a Brazilian, who later became Brazilian environment minister, a Swede, and Reddy. Okay, four continents. They wrote a book which is called Energy for a Sustainable World. And essentially, he pioneered there what he called a demand side rather than supply side approach to energy. So for example, Guelph needs 500 megawatts, is short of 500 megawatts. A supply side approach would be build a nuclear reactor of 500 megawatts. A demand side approach would be let's study the ways in which electricity is transmitted, houses are built, cement is used, and can we minimize energy so that we don't even need those 500 megawatts, right? So A.K. Reddy is an Indian scientist who deserves to be much better known, inspired by Gandhi to bend his science towards Gandhian principles, modern science. PhD from Imperial College. Okay. The other is someone I've worked with very closely, a great ecologist called Mahatma Gandhi. Again, PhD from Harvard. While at Harvard, an ecologist. He wrote a paper that is still a citation classic. He got a job at Harvard, left it, and comes back to India. And starts then working on essentially biodiversity conservation and harmonizing biodiversity conservation with the rights of villagers who live in and around protected areas, and has done the most amazing work. Most recently, he's now in his 70s, he's still very, very active. Most recently, his last major piece of work was a long report on the Western Ghats, which is a mountain system around the West, and how, if curbs were not put on unregulated mining, there would be floods. Curbs were not put, and there have been floods all across Kerala. So here are two, especially for the younger Indians, anyone, two great Gandhian scientists, who are trained in the greatest Western universities, who achieved true distinction in their fields, and came back to follow Gandhi's ideas and bend their science to the service of the poor. And they've been great models for me, so I'm glad that your question allowed me to pay my tribute to them. A.K.N. Reddy and Madhav Gandhi.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for your speech and offering a totally different perspective that I could probably not get off of social media. And I just wanted to ask you kind of in general terms, as an upcoming generation that is far or a little bit more globalized and interconnected when it comes to forms of social media and news sources, regarding, concerns of climate and stuff that is happening at a faster rate than anticipated. I know many people my age often feel kind of lost. We don't know where to go, what to do, besides just, look at predictions. And so I was just going to ask you, would there be any way, or could you advise us where to go or what kind of steps we can take considering all these?
So, I appreciate the urgency and the sentiment behind that question. I don't preach. I don't prescribe. I try to study, understand, write, analyze, and so people to do what they want. I don't preach and prescribe out of a philosophical preference. Also, I've conspicuously failed with my own children, so I wouldn't want to do it. But still, with due respect to your question, I'd like to say two things. The first thing is, the first comes from Gandhi. That is, Gandhi believed in one step at a time. Incrementalism is enough. Change the life of your home, your family, your street. That's fantastic. Don't think you can change the world. So that's, if you live a more decent life, a more transparent life, if you trespass less on the earth, if you persuade other people around you to let trespass on the earth, that's a great contribution. Gandhi always said, one step at a time. That's one Gandhian principle. The second Gandhian principle also comes from a phrase of Gandhi, which is a great phrase, the beauty of compromise. And I'll give you a concrete illustration from an Indian environmental conflict, the Narmada Dam that I talked about. Now, there's a long history of large dams being built in India, which have never fulfilled their promises. So when this new large dam was coming up, you had this extraordinary Gandhian activist called Medha Patkar, who organized a protest movement against it. But as she was organizing the protest movement, the dam kept on coming up. The slogan of the movement against the dam was, nobody will move, the dam will never come up. Koi nahi hatega, baan nahi banega. So they were absolutely convinced of their total success, and they would demolish the dam and no one had to leave there. Okay. So that was the slogan of the movement. But the state kept on building it, they kept on crushing the movement, and the dam kept up and up. Meanwhile, the movement gathered wide support across India, and two Gandhian engineers came up with a compromise solution. Originally, the dam was supposed to be 460 feet. And if it came up to its full extent, it would displace 150,000 people. It had already come up to 80 meters, which was about 270 feet. And the activists were still saying, demolish the dam, no one will move, the dam will never come up. But it's come to 270 feet, billions of rupees have been spent. These two engineers then designed a very interesting technical compromise solution, where they said, don't go up to 450. But however, if you go up to only to 400, you will still reach water to the most drought-deprived areas of Western India, and you will minimize displacement by 60%. So 60% less people lose their lives. But the activists said, no compromise, you're selling out. So that's the second lesson, the beauty of compromise. Don't think you can achieve perfection. The third thing I'd like to say is again to do with climate change. I think there's a problem there's a climate change excess today. There are many environmental problems in the world today that have nothing to do with climate change. There are many social, political problems in the world today, such as religious violence, gender violence, that have nothing to do with climate change. Somehow we're being told, the social media is telling you climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change. And I think that is a problem. I think this idea that there is one real problem, one alternative, one solution, and then there'll be utopia, I think is problematic. So I just caution you philosophically in this way. I can't give you concrete advice. Yeah.
I just had another question regarding Indian scholars and their views on globalism and how that affects climate change. And one of my favorite scholars, Vandana Shiva, she's a staunch against globalism. Do you feel that Gandhi's critique of Western economic systems, Western capitalist systems, are a grassroots or a more rudimentary version of anti-globalism? Is it fair to classify them as that?
I have a problem. I believe you must act in your own street. And it's easy to say you're an anti-global activist and forget what's happening around you. So I have problems with those who call themselves global anti-global activists. They're normally on a flight going all around the world preaching against globalization, right? So I'm not sure. Yeah, John?
Ram, thank you very much for a very, very stimulating talk. I'm sort of struck by, was it 1913 when Gandhi writes about if we industrialize like Britain,
1928.
1928 we'll strip the world like locusts. And then, you know, your point about how much environmental damage has been done, never mind climate change in India. I mean, the absolute priority that is being given in India to achieving fantastically high rates of economic growth is bringing about extraordinary kind of environmental destruction. I'm particularly struck by the pressures on water. You know, and you mentioned your piece about, you know, where does Bangalore's water come from? You know, think of the pressures on water in Chennai this summer. I mean, India's development surely is going to come up very soon against the problem of water shortage. What action is taking place? What's going on? I mean, you know, you mentioned also Modi has an answer for everything, or people think Modi has an answer for everything. He is emphasizing water conservation, supposedly. I just, you know, wonder what your observations are about the ways in which and the extent to which this particular problem is being addressed.
No, it's a very important question, John. You know, I think John Maynard Keynes famously said that every ruling politician is in thrall to the discredited ideas of an outdated economist. Something like that. I'm quoting him slightly out of, you know the quote. Okay. And what's the problem in India today is that the political elite, either they're destroying the environment for nefarious reasons, getting cuts from contractors, or they're destroying it in the mistaken belief because they're enthralled to economists of the 60s and 70s who believe that the market can resolve all scarcities, that environmentalism is a luxury only rich countries can afford, and so on and so forth. So, and also there is, I think, something else. There is the two other constraints to environmental responsibility of the political class. So there's corruption, there's enthralled to outdated ideas, there's the 5-year election cycle. Because you can say, I'll give you a job in 5 years, but you can't say I can clean up all the river of the Ganga in 5 years, right? And there's a fourth problem, which is the first past the post system. Because if you have proportional representation, you can have an effective Green Party. That's what we learned from Europe. And unlike here, unlike in, I don't know much about Canada, but in North America, where you have a two-party system, right? Republican Democrats. If you have 10%, if you have a proportional, you can probably have a red-green party that gets 8% and is in Indian Parliament and is consistently haranguing people. So I think there are huge constraints, and I don't see any really light at the end of the tunnel. I think we are going to go down. I mean, there's a wonderful image of Gandhi, which I didn't quote, where he's talking about modern man. Modern man's enchantment with speed, with technology, with growth. He says, it's like a moth circling around a flame. Circles so enchanted by the flame, circles faster and faster and faster and faster and perishes in the flame. Right. So there may be something of that kind. So there are kind of technological, philosophical, material, political economy constraints to environmental responsibility in India. That doesn't mean we mustn't do scholarship. It doesn't mean activists must not keep on struggling to at least mitigate some of that suffering. But I don't really see environmental wisdom coming in. I think decentralization could be a way forward. And that has been stalled. I mean, if you look at, in my state, Karnataka, right now we have a decentralized system in which village councils have no autonomy. They just elect their leaders, but they don't have financial autonomy. They can't raise taxes. The natural resources are not under their control. If, for example, there's a grazing ground. I mean, these examples are there everywhere, as you know. There's a grazing ground. The villages are using it. They're using it sustainably because they have a kind of common property regime going. And that under that grazing ground, gold is found. The chief minister in Bangalore signs an agreement with the gold merchant and gives it away because the law allows that. So decentralization, where local councils may have more control, more autonomy, would lead to more sustainability without a question. So I think we have to think, but it's a very long haul. I mean, in the short term, India's environment is going to degrade further and further, and the costs of that degradation are going to be borne by the poor.
Yeah.
More and more. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Guha, for coming to Guelph. I really enjoyed your presentation. I was struck by your comment about whether or not the world could withstand a country of 300 million developing in the way the West did. So environmentalism can be focused on how we live, but it can also be focused on how many of us are living. And I was wondering if Gandhi ever despaired about population growth, either in South Asia or in the world or elsewhere.
No,
Elsewhere, not meaning Mars.
not really. And this is a very old debate among environmentalists. Is it population in absolute terms, or is it population versus resource consumed by sections of the population? And of course, a Bangladeshi diplomat famously said in the UN in the 1970s that, if you go to an American supermarket, you find not only that one Bangladeshi, that 70 Bangladeshis consume as much as one American. 10 Bangladeshis consume as much as one American dog, because you go to a supermarket and you see all those dog food things being sold. So there's a problem with making population the most important thing. It is not. It is, obviously, there's a finite number of human beings this world can sustain. But as soon as you privilege population, you are stigmatizing the poorer parts of the world. And the poorer parts of the richer countries. There are too many Ram Guhas. Because I live in a nice house, I drive a car. If you look at my carbon footprint, it's that of 80 average Indians. So I always have a problem with making population central to the environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Guha. I just wanted to ask this question, that you spoke about Gandhi wanting science to be used on a more practical level. That was what he wanted as a practical application of science. Now, keeping that in mind, what do you think about India's recent foray into space? And could that money or those resources have been used for clean water, environment? What are your thoughts on that?
So, no, I think there is nothing wrong with India going to space. There is wrong with the Prime Minister trying to claim political mileage out of it. The search for outside, And there's something wrong with the Indian scientific community becoming complicit in the creation of a cult of personality. So I, right now, have the great privilege of occupying a chair for 1 year in the Institute of Science, named after Satish Dhawan, who basically built India's space program. Satish Dhawan was an extraordinary scientist. He would have wanted space to be used not merely to demonstrate India's technological might, but to use it to solve India's agricultural problems. Satish Dhawan was someone who was he was the only major scientist who signed the petition of the Narmada movement about displacement, right? Now, so I can't say we shouldn't go on to space. I think that's that. But when scientists become complicit in the construction of a personality cult, in a kind of machismo kind of nationalism, that's the problem. That would be my answer. So I don't think we don't have money to that. I think that would be, because science is about search, creation, and why can't Indians also go to space? However, the problem is different. That even as our current government is showing so much interest in our space program, it is steadily undermining the institutions of scientific research that have been built over 60 years. For example, agriculture. Under the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, there are 100 odd institutes. 60 of them don't have full-time directors. Why don't they have full-time directors? Because under an archaic system, the Prime Minister, it's all centralized. The experts can't decide. The Prime Minister has to sign off on each. And the Prime Minister does not have the time or has to make sure that the person appointed is totally loyal to him before he signs. So that is the truth. 60 out of 100. So it's not a question of space. It's a question of the scientific infrastructure that we have, that was built up by visionary prime ministers like Jocelyn LaRue, And these to be taken to the next level by people, by prime ministers who can live in the 21st century, because Nehru also made mistakes. You don't need a Nehru today. And who can cultivate intellectual autonomy. So that, for example, today, you cannot appoint a vice chancellor of a central university without the prime minister's office deciding. So those are the real problems of scientific research and expertise in India today, not space.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, or in general, did Gandhi's ideas about gender and kind of bringing women more into the public sphere relate to his ideas about environmentalism at all? And if not, how do you think gender and environmentalism are important going forward in India?
So, on the first, Gandhi's, the way to understand Gandhi and gender is that from the perspective of 2019, Gandhi was a hopeless anti-feminist patriarch. From the perspective of 1919, when he lived and worked, he did more to bring women into public life than any other male of his time. So he did more than Churchill or de Gaulle or Mao or Roosevelt or Mackenzie King or anyone. So in his movements in South Africa, women went to jail. In 1924, at a time in which women did not have the vote across the Western world, Gandhi made sure that the Indian National Congress, India's preeminent party, had a female president, Sarojini Naidu. In the Salt March of the 1930s, women went to jail in a deeply conservative society. When to come out the street meant no one would marry. So Gandhi, however, of course, he was not a thoroughgoing modern feminist. He was ambivalent about women working. But he created the possibility of women in a very hierarchical, conservative, patriarchal society. Gandhi did enormous amounts to bring women into the public sphere. And in some ways, we've gone backwards now. So one of Gandhi's great female associates was someone called Hansa Mehta, who was in the Indian Constituent Assembly and who incidentally helped frame the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And among her contributions to the UN Declaration of Human Rights were to change man to humanity. She was one of a female mentored by Gandhi. After independence, she became vice chancellor of a new university in Baroda, one of whose products is India's only post-independence Nobel laureate, the physicist Venki Ramakrishnan. Now, no good Indian university today has female vice chancellors because the men have come back. So in that sense, Gandhi was a pioneer in bringing women to public life, but of course, he did not have the ideas you and me would have. I mean, my daughter would find him a hopeless reactionary, and in some respects he was, in the way he treated his wife, for example. He expected his wife to follow him. Right. But he did bring a lot of women into public life, also in professional life. Gender and environmentalism is a long and complex debate. I'd urge you to read the writings of the Indian economist Beena Agarwal, if you've not read them. You know her writings? Yeah. So I think that, I mean, of course, it's somewhere, that's a very important, I mean, I think it's there, she's talked about it. And Gandhi didn't really talk about that. But he did, I'd say this, that he was not a feminist, but he did much more to bring women into public life than any other male political leader of his day.
Yeah. I follow the question on gender. So in the last few years, we've seen quite a bit of revisionist history, going back to Gandhi and saying he's a racist and bringing down his statues in some parts of Africa. And also within India, quite a few critical scholars talking about Gandhi as a casteist. Mm-hmm. So how do we abandon Gandhi? How do we engage with all this criticism? It would be nice to hear from someone like you.
So I think he wrote a great deal. And a lot of it is his ideas evolved. So if you take both race and caste, Gandhi was a racist as a young man. He goes to South Africa in the 1890s, and he's a racist. Indians are racists. their culture, including, as the marriage advertisements show in 2020, also they're racist. Gandhi thought, as a young man when he was in South Africa, that the Europeans were the most civilized, Indians were almost as civilized, and Africans were backward. But in his 20 years in South Africa, he outgrew that racism. And by the time he left, he had decisively repudiated it. And proof of this is found in the statement he makes in the 20s and 30s, his conversations with people like W.E.B. Du Bois, with Howard Thurman, who was Martin Luther King's mentor, who goes to Sevagram and talks to Gandhi, and whom Gandhi says, it is through you, Negroes, which is the term then used, that the message of non-violence will really reach the world. So much of the criticism of Gandhi and race is motivated, uninformed, anachronistic. Likewise with caste, he slowly moves. I mean, I talked about this at great length in McMaster yesterday. He begins by saying untouchability is bad, but the caste system can remain. Then the next step is to go towards promoting intermixing, as in the temple entry movement, interdining, and finally intermarriage as well. And Gandhi had this great capacity to evolve and grow, partly based on experience. With race, it was experience. The longer he lived in South Africa, the more he saw the Africans, worked with them, and saw that you couldn't just, dismiss them in a patronizing or prejudiced way. With caste, often is critique. I mean, if you look at the evolution of his views on caste, it is the great Malayali social reformer Narayana Guru and then Ambedkar who push him towards taking a more critical position. Unfortunately, a lot of the criticism of Gandhi is based on just selective quotation out of context. He's continuously evolving, and moving towards a more capacious understanding of the world. This is not to say that he was flawless or faultless. I mean, for example, his treatment of his wife, his family, his ashramites, his experiments with celibacy, which placed a burden on his people. I mean, those certainly there.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much. Your presentation was a really interesting perspective for me that I've never heard before. But my question is, I've been studying the Indian independence revolution for a while in a couple different classes, and I know that there are very many different perspectives and different nationalists that worked for different things during the movement. And obviously, Gandhi is one type of perspective, but did this environmental perspective permeate to any other nationalists, or was it just him?
Again, I didn't have time in my talk, but your question allows me to elaborate on this. There were other people in the 20s and 30s, before India became independent, warning India not to emulate mindlessly Western styles of industrial development. There were other early environmentalists in India, very active. Two of them were Gandhi's close followers. One was an economist called J.C. Kumarappa, who greatly inspired E.F. Schumacher's The Small is Beautiful, and was an environmental economist. There's a new biography of J.C. Kumarappa called The Web of Freedom. So he's, in the 20s and 30s, here is an economist saying, when we become independent, we must find more sustainable forms of energy and technology to develop. He's one. Another person, I briefly mentioned, Albert Howard, who's a pioneer of organic agriculture, who actually worked in India for many years. The third person, who is a great personal favorite of mine, and on whom I hope one day to write a little bit, was a Scottish town planner called Patrick Geddes, who lived in India in the 1920s, and who, unlike Gandhi, recognized that we were also an urban civilization, and wrote a series of town plans on how to make Indian cities more habitable, how to conserve natural and cultural heritage, and how to, promote sustainability in terms of water and transport within. So there were a series of precocious environmental thinkers in India in the 20s and 30s, who, after we became independent, the political and the intellectual elite comprehensively disregarded as backward reactionaries who had no relevance to India becoming strong, modern, industrialized. And then in the 1970s, you had the rebirth of environmentalism to the movements I described. So there was a lot of Gandhi was not the only person thinking along these lines, but he was the only political leader thinking along these lines.
Thank you.
Just two very quick questions. My mom's from Trinidad, where a lot of indentured laborers went. I'm just wondering if you could comment maybe on Gandhi's view of the British Caribbean and Indians there. And secondly, what happened to Gandhi's kids? I mean, some of them seem to have really fallen off the rails, and I'm wondering if you could comment a bit on that, because I'm always fascinated by his personal story of that.
So, I mean, on the second question, if you have the patience to read 1,600 volumes of my biography, you'll get all the details. But very briefly, Gandhi had 4 children. With the first, he had a deeply problematic relationship, Harilal, whom he expected too much of and who was like destroyed by his father's expectations, became an alcoholic, and there's a wonderful film on him. That was Harilal. The second son, Manilal, stayed on in South Africa and was part of the anti-apartheid struggle and was known to Nelson Mandela and so on. And there's a good biography of him. The third son, Ramdas, just had a quiet life in Nagpur. The fourth son, Devdas, was a major figure in the Indian independence struggle and the editor of the major nationalist newspaper, the Hindustan Times, for 15 years and went to jail and so on. So that's the story of the children. On the first, since you come from Trinidad, you know, Gandhi may not even have known where Trinidad was. He was not a pretty well-read man. But he had an extraordinary English associate called C.F. Andrews, who was a Christian priest. I mean, a mark of Gandhi's capacious Catholicism. Gandhi's closest friend was a British Christian priest called Charles Freer Andrews, whom he met in South Africa when Gandhi was fighting for the indentured laborers in South Africa. And then Gandhi goes back to India in 1915, and C.F. Andrews spends the next 15 years traveling through the Caribbean, through Fiji, through Kenya, campaigning successfully for the abolition of indentured laborers. So the campaign to abolish indentured labor in the Caribbean and in Fiji and in East Africa is led by is inspired by one of Gandhi's closest associates, a quite remarkable man called C.F. Andrews, and you can read his biographies if you wish. Thank you.
Well, thank you so. Before you leave, you're not quite done yet. Ram, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I think your exposition has really opened our eyes into both the life of Gandhi, but also the implications that his life continues to have in the world today. It's a small token of our appreciation. A hint, it's not one of your books, I think you could tell. But thank you very much. Thank you so much.